Eric,
Omar,
what do we know?
I don't know what we know, but I do know what we don't know. And sometimes you have to figure out, does what you know match what you know? And if it does, then maybe you do know what you know. But if what you think you know isn't supported by what you do know, then maybe you don't know what you know.
You know what I know?
No.
Pain don't hurt much. Welcome, folks, to the fifth, it's not a round table, but pain science discussion, where we're really going to dive into it this time. We've been skirting around the issues. We've been talking, kind of on the outside, so to speak, not really digging into the nitty gritty. But with Helms, that's what we're doing today.
Yeah. Oh, I'm getting a call.
Oh no.
So our TikTok crew, who we haven't mentioned in at least 2 years, Omar.
Well, they aged out. You're not familiar with the new app?
No. What is it?
Zip-Zop.
Zip-Zop. Okay.
Yeah.
It's like
TikTok, but for 12-year-olds instead of 14-year-olds.
How about Generation Z or whatever we're on at this point? We're out of the alphabet. We're on alphanumeric or just emojis. It's kind of like, Prince became a symbol. Mm-hmm. Your generation is not something we can say out loud. It's an expression of an idea.
Yeah.
But yeah, unfortunately, our now aged out, older, well, let's face it, Omar, you and I, we're older. So it's amazing that we've even reached the TikTok generation. But through dance, they have told us on TikTok, which is then communicated into my ears, they actually don't want another pain science roundtable.
What?
Unfortunately.
That generation is unfathomable in terms of their complexity, but unreasonable in terms of their stupidity, because I cannot co-sign that.
Yeah, at the same time, we're
beholden to them.
Exactly.
They're so Eric, I do just want to say this, man.
Yeah.
People think that, the average age, maybe people can comment down below on YouTube, which is definitely the way we're going to get an accurate sample of who listens to our culture. But one would assume it's like people roughly in their 20-something, 30-something, 40-something, and then beyond. Like that's definitely, it wouldn't be teenagers. People would assume, right? Like it's not, but man, we're thriving on there because they love bite-sized content on TikTok. And as we know, with a podcast, that's the best way to consume it. Don't listen to the full thing. Don't listen to even half of it. Don't listen to the first 20 minutes or whatever. Listen to 10 seconds.
Yep. And we have been getting our episodes down to, so we call it an hour of power.
Yeah.
And they obviously are going to last, of course, 70 minutes.
Right.
And then we've had I think you did a lightning hour of power. Yeah. That was meant to be 45 minutes, and it lasted like 55 minutes with Trex.
That was unfortunate. Yeah. We made an error. Yeah, we gave more. That's what we do around here. It's supposed to be 45 minutes, and we gave 55. Correct.
Under promise, over deliver, or under deliver, overcook the pizza. I don't know, but nonetheless, instead of potentially another pain science roundtable, which has been flagged in dance form by our TikTok audience.
It's interpretive dance, though, Helms. It's kind of hard to understand what they're saying, but I think you're very reasonable. I think you're very reasonable.
It's hard to know what they're trying to communicate, and that's
hard for them to know.
It is hard for them to know. It's hard to know what you know, and maybe that's what we should be talking about today: is how do we know what we know?
Eric, so I like that, and I will say, because we're beholden to the TikTok crew, which is the largest contingent of listeners. Let's compromise here. So it'll be like, we'll say 45 minutes, the episode. So it's like an hour of power TikTok edition. I don't know how they're going to be able to splice this one up because it's so short. You might as well on TikTok just upload the whole thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think their reels are just, I think you have to keep them to 40 minutes now. I think they've dropped the length a little bit. So I don't see any issue with that. So yeah.
Imagine as a counter movement, which I'm sure actually does exist, that people are actively pursuing like forms of content that are longer because they realize, okay, like how much can I actually, digest in a 15-second, like how much is there? And there's almost like a counter movement. That's what I want to believe. So we're going to give them the 45 minutes. We've been, talking about this idea of how do we know what we know? And there's something kind of, would you say, Eric, it's sort of going around the fitness space. What are we talking about here in this episode today? Like, how do you want to tee this up? We spoke before the episode about, both things not going on in the space, but just a common issue, let's say, that occurs in any field really, and exercise science is no different when it comes to, individuals that participate in it. I'll leave it there. You continue.
No, thank you for teeing that up. And essentially, I have been getting very, very similar questions multiple times. And this kind of parallels something that Trexler was talking about, ironically, when we were kind of doing the second Pain Science Roundtable, is that the biopsychosocial model has become very popular in our understanding of pain, injury, rehabilitation, and there's been a revolution in clinical practice on the physical therapy side of things. But he has spoken to the fact that sometimes people are only providing lip service to that. They haven't really thought through it. And they're focusing on the new and shiny part of it, which is the psychosocial component, and kind of forgetting that there are sometimes very clear biological root causes of certain issues, and that they may have a relatively straightforward biomedical solution. And I think you did a great job in that episode pointing out how people really need to be specific and talk through certain things, and how just kind of taking these blanket statements and understandings about a topic or focusing on a model like the biopsychosocial model and then coming to these conclusions that don't really have the depth or the nuance can sometimes lead people astray. So in the world of hypertrophy, especially the evidence-based community, there are some pretty predictable personalities. And there's an inherent conflict in the personalities that are attracted to science, promote science, and how science philosophically actually needs to be done. I've talked about this before. But simply put, I think people who are attracted to evidence-based content, and especially people who produce it, they like to have definitive answers. They would prefer to live in a world that is black and white, even if they acknowledge that we simply do not. However, the reality of research on humans, medical research, sports science, anything like that, where we're doing sampling, is that at best, the quote-unquote black and white is a probabilistic-based understanding where we're weighing, say, an odds ratio or a probability or calculating the confidence interval and effect size. There's always uncertainty around something. Further, even now today in 2024, our understanding of human physiology is incomplete. And we probably know something like 1/10 of everything that's going on in the human body, which sounds crazy when you think about how many publications come out and what we do know and the things we can do with modern science and modern medical technology, et cetera, AI, all that good stuff. Like, we're in an exciting time. Things are changing quickly, yet we still don't have all of the pathways uncovered for what drives mechanistically hypertrophy. There's still people arguing about mechanisms, and there's things we just don't fully understand, and it's not like sports science is well funded. So these mismatches, they produce a certain type of content, which is definitive explanations of how things work, and then and therefore outcome of this is what you should do. And even when people rely on empirical peer-reviewed research, sometimes these statements are too declarative. They're not open enough for the fact that perhaps sampling variance, an issue with replication down the line, too low of sample sizes, or misattribution as to why that outcome occurred. Could it have been some type of confounding effect of a covariate might have happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One example of this, when done in good faith as best as possible, was just the way things get analyzed. So we've had Martin Ruffalo on here now, Dr. Ruffalo, who I had the pleasure and privilege of being part of his supervisory team for his PhD. We did a meta-analysis where we looked at training to failure. And we did not find a significant effect of training to failure being better than training not to failure. And we even did multiple categorical analyses of different definitions of failure. So momentary muscular failure, where the concentric is actually failing, or voluntary failure, which is any other definition besides that. And we found some slight differences, but overall we went, it's probably important to be close to failure, but you don't need to go to it. Fast forward just months later, and now it's actually been published. But Zach Robinson, now Dr. Robinson, completed a meta-regression, which is a continuous analysis rather than categorical, which found a pretty clear relationship where the closer you get to failure, the more stimulative that set is for hypertrophy. Now, with a lot of other caveats. So these are two accurately done, properly done meta-analyses or meta-regression meta-analysis, depending upon how you want to categorize it, that came to slightly different conclusions, even though they were looking at the same data, but we just got a larger data set, a continuous analysis, and we refined the nuance with which we were looking at it and did different moderator analyses. And now we have a better understanding that does to some degree conflict with our prior understanding. And that's doing it right. Now, some of the approaches that I have seen lately and the subsequent questions that have come from it on social media are doing it in a way that I would advise is probably not the appropriate approach we should take for human-based research from an epistemological perspective. And that's just the epistemology is the study of how do we know things. And ultimately, it comes down to the philosophy of science, something that I think is under-taught in sports science specifically, but probably more broadly in quantitative research on humans. The philosophy of science is something that I've only learned post-PhD and post-masters, and that I've now really started to focus on because it's important, making sure that we make the right inferences and that we take the right approach to future research. So anyway, I've had a lot of questions as of late with strong declarative opinions on a firm understanding of how the mechanisms of hypertrophy occur. This model, sometimes proposed as a model, this idea that tension is applied at the fiber level, and that is the primary mechanism driving hypertrophy, and here's the way it works, here's the way fatigue operates, and therefore, based upon that mechanistic understanding, you should train in X, Y, and Z ways. And even when I bring up, hey, that may be a primary mechanism or even part of the way it works, but maybe it's not fully complete. We don't have all the data. You're probably being a little too firm on this. But more importantly, your conclusion based upon that model of therefore we should train in this way doesn't seem supported by the data. Hey, here's 2 meta-analyses, for example, that seem to conflict with that mechanistic understanding leading to your assumptions about training. The response is, well, there's something wrong with those studies. And I think that is problematic because any model that is worth its salt to the point where we're actually using it to prescribe real-world application, right? Here's what you should do in training. I'm a personal trainer. I got this model. It should comport with the applied research. So something that I have colloquially described as the quote-unquote chain of research, if the goal is for it to lead to practice in sports science, is the idea that we start with mechanistic research, then we go to applied or translational research, translational meaning that it should translate to practice, and then it actually gets taken out into the real world, tested and tried, and then you get feedback from those coaches and those practitioners as to some of the ways that it does or does not fit from an ecological validity perspective. Like, oh, that's great, but people don't have access to this, or that's great, but having a 20 calorie surplus is too challenging because the error that people have doesn't make any sense. Okay, then we bring it back and we modify some of the suggestions we'd make based upon that applied research. So you go from mechanistic research to create a hypothesis to applied research to practice. And jumping steps is where we have typically had some of the most emblematic errors in epistemology and exercise science. For example, we think we know something about growth hormone. Cool, growth hormone, good for hypertrophy. That's probably an oversimplification, but it's not fundamentally wrong. Therefore, any training that results in higher growth hormone, better. And now we get the recommendation for shorter rest intervals, which didn't pan out, right? Our understanding of the hormonal response to exercise, kind of carrying on in that theme. The idea, oh, actually, you know what? We want to do these big compound movements to get more circulating growth hormone. That'll actually help you with your arm training. Also didn't pan out. So there's multiple incidences where we can look back and we made assumptions about a mechanism and then carried out into training. And because of some issue with the mechanism or the methodology, it didn't translate. The recommendation where you need to eat every 3 hours to get a protein synthesis spike doesn't seem to comport with the real world data. So we had unrealistic, very restrictive recommendations for meal frequency and protein timing for a long time until people went, hold on, when we actually test this model or this understanding of how protein synthesis should work in response to feeding versus real world data, there's a disconnect. Why? So we really need to kind of learn from that history that when we jump from mechanism to practice without the applied research, we're essentially missing the opportunity to test the veracity of a mechanistic model. So what I wanted to talk about today, Omar, was A, why is it so attractive? And I get it. We want a clear black and white mathematical answer. That's probably the personalities we have which attracted us to science in the first place. And when someone provides clear mechanisms so they can go from A to B to C to D, and they go, right, if hypertrophy operates in this way, I understand that. And if here are the mechanisms of fatigue, I understand that. Then therefore I should train this way, case closed. And if I see something that conflicts with that, I'm going to look for the error in that thing. Rather than maintaining a level of humility and understanding of the limitations of the research that we have on some of the foundational physiology and going, all right, we think things operate this way. That's great. Okay. Now I'm going to look at the real world data. If there's a conflict, that means one of two things. It could be that there's an issue with the actual study, maybe something, a confounding factor, sampling variance, et cetera. Or it could mean that there is something I'm missing in my foundational understanding of the mechanisms and the physiology. So at what point do you decide which one it could be? If it's 1, 2, 3 studies on relatively non-representative types of studies that don't perfectly test the model's assumptions, fair enough. I think that's a reasonable assumption, or at least a possibility. But when we're talking about, say, multiple meta-analyses of, say, 20 plus studies that have been done over a decade that all seem to conflict with the fundamental assumptions in the model, at that point, you must question the model. Either it is just wrong or it's incomplete. And I think there seems to be an issue right now where people are relatively familiar with a model or this proposed idea of how things work, but they haven't actually looked into testing it. Are they blowing on that house of cards, as I think Trexler said one time? And I think sometimes we are actually in a situation where it is not a robust model that clearly describes something and has a very testable set of assumptions in it that have been firmly grounded, but rather it is actually a proverbial house of cards. And some of the assumptions baked into it are based upon a limited understanding of physiology or in a limited context. And for some reason, they're conflicting with the applied research. So that is what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to have a discussion on how models should be used in scientific research, when they're appropriate to be used, and different types of models and what they even mean.
Eric, I love it. Let's go on a quick tangent here because you brought up the philosophy of science, and then you also brought up sometimes how people can become potentially, once again, too attached to these models because perhaps individuals are fixated on wanting to know or have an answer in spite of, other evidence or contrary things where then they would say, hey, low sample size or whatnot. But even in the face of, a few meta-analysis, they would say A, B, C, D, this is why I still believe in the model. And then you brought up the idea of humility as it relates to these individuals. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned at the very start, and then we kind of wrapped around here. What do you think is at fault here? Do you think it's a lack of understanding where you brought up the philosophy of science? Is it just the individuals that are attracted to science in general, which is also something you brought up? Like basically, how do we get into this scenario here where people become attached too much to said models as opposed to taking a look either at the chain of research that you brought up or what Trexler just said, blowing on this house of cards? Like what is actually, in your opinion, at fault where it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this is not only an exercise science, but like kind of a reoccurring issue. Like you brought up as an example, like meal timing or what have you, where here's a model. Well, when we start testing out, well, wait a minute, it actually doesn't translate. Why do we see this happen time and time again? You brought up those various things, or like some of these people, once again, the lack of humility. But what do you think are some of the causes behind why we continue to have this conversation then?
I don't just think it's arrogance. I don't think it's just a lack of humility. I think it's just how attractive it is to have clear-cut answers, So when you, as a science communicator, I see this time and time again, when I share a kind of cool, hypothetical element of science, a study that answers a question, but it also, unfortunately, and as it often does, leaves us with more questions than answers, the common responses, the most common questions I get are, well, what does that mean? And they're asking me to speculate beyond what I can with the data. Yep. And even when I am willing to do so, and I do speculate, they don't hear speculation. They hear the definitive answer. Okay. So, this study only compared low volumes. And they had one group do low, 1 times per week frequency, another one do 3 times per week frequency. But do you think if people did high volume, the higher frequency would be better? And I go, I think that makes sense because there's a certain point when you can just do too much in a single session where the quality degrades. And that isn't going, and the understanding is not, oh, we need to test that to confirm this speculation. It is, okay, cool. So high frequencies are in fact better when you're dealing with higher volumes because people want definitive answers. We're an applied field. It's not a theoretical thing in physics, for example, where we're trying to understand when and why dark matter is relevant, or is it real, or is it manifest. It's not an abstract concept. It's something people want to do on Tuesday, and people already have strong opinions about it because they're doing it in the trenches, and they can hold up their specific anecdote to either support or counter the given claim. So I think because it is something that is already being done, that people are already making claims about, and because people are not comfortable with uncertainty, I don't think it's an arrogance. I think it's actually a little bit of fear of the unknown and the inability to sit in ignorance. People don't like that. And I don't think we reward it in terms of our content creators. I think the people who do have strong claims, and we have data on this, the more confidence someone can have when they present a given answer, they're going to be rated by the listener or the reader as more likely to be an expert, which is actually false. So it is, I think, very understandable when it comes to the personalities involved. And I think we don't do a very good job in undergraduate programs of teaching the philosophy of science. We don't teach people what does a p-value actually mean. This is changing, but the typical way that someone would see a p-value less than 0.05 is cool, that's the cutoff, and it is correct. Rather than understanding that the p-value represents the probability that something could have occurred due to chance, assuming a sufficient sample size. So another example of this is there are some content creators who I've seen where if something is significant and a study found a thing, they will accept it as true, and they really struggle with why another study doing the same thing did not find that to be true. And they'll look through the methods to try to figure out why one found it and why one didn't. And it may be related to the methods, but it also could just come down to straight up sampling variance, right? So the idea that there can be studies with results that are not black and white, that they are due to random variation, is a relatively uncomfortable place to be in the world, knowing that you can test something and you want science to be the razor that provides us the clear-cut black and white answers. But in reality, it's like, hey, if you do 10 studies and the majority of them are leaning one direction, now we can have a pretty precise estimate of how we think things work in most cases with some caveats. That's not satisfying. It's kind of scary. I don't think people really acknowledge that. I don't think they actually feel fear that they can identify, from their rational brain when it happens. But I think people are far more comfortable living in a world, especially when they're trying to get science to give them concrete, quantitative answers, when it gives them that sense of security and they can draw a straight line from A to B to C to D to E to F and go, that's how it should work, and I can predict things, etc. Now, Omar, the ironic thing, though, is that people are attracted to that, but models, if they are at the point when they can inform practice, should actually be mathematical models, meaning that you can do math in these constructs which fit the real world data. But what is often missing in these models is that they're more exploratory, they're more conceptual, and they have not applied actual numbers to them. And what I referred to earlier, for example, Zach Robinson's meta-regression, that's an example of actual modeling. They extracted the repetitions in reserve from hundreds of studies, or at least hundreds of participants across study groups and treatments, and they looked at the actual standardized changes in hypertrophy, and then they plotted different types of model fits. So they looked at the X and Y axis between these two and went, all right, is it a curvilinear approach best? Is logarithmic? Is a linear fit best? And then you could actually see the model. And that's actually not what's occurring. So if someone does have a quote unquote model that's at the point, again, where it's informing practice, they should actually be doing modeling, believe it or not, crazy as that sounds, to be able to prove it, rather than saying, hey, we got some mechanistic research, this is what it seems to suggest, therefore do this, and I'm going to create an infographic that's more of like a conceptual model, but it's not truly like a model that is meant to fit the data. And that's an important point, Because if we actually think about the philosophy of science, when are we using models to inform practice? There are specific times when you're supposed to. So for example, models are typically used when it is implausible, infeasible, logistically challenging, or simply impossible in some cases in other fields to experimentally test something. So like when we talk about experimental physics and what we understand of black holes, we didn't actually fly a probe out to a black hole and see at what point the event horizon sucked in and we stopped getting data back. We modeled it, right? You have to. There's no choice. But if you want to understand hypertrophy and frequency, you don't have to do a model. Guess what? You can recruit people and have them train with different frequencies under volume equated conditions and have everything else be controlled. So in many cases where I'm seeing these models, quote unquote, being applied to practice in sports science or practice in exercise science, I'm going, all right, why are we going off of a model when we actually have empirical data? So that's kind of the biggest issue, and I don't think people understand that. Direct measurements of the outcomes of interest under controlled conditions are always more reliable than the modeled estimates of outcomes. And that's even true if we talk about the models that exist in sports science. So for example, you can do force velocity profiling. So you can actually look at how much force someone's producing at different speeds in a given task. And you can estimate what their, what load would be associated with maximal force or maximum velocity, for example. An even simpler way to do this is load velocity profiling, right? Barbell back squat, okay? We take, you do a few reps at 40% with maximal intent to accelerate the bar 60% and 80%. You can use that to then predict what is their 1RM if we assume what their minimum velocity would be. Guess what? That's less accurate than actually doing a 1RM test. That should not be surprising to people, right? And we don't have to rely on a load velocity profile. We can do a 1RM test. But there are times when it might be better to do a velocity-based training protocol because I don't want you to do a max out. But you understand, okay, I'm not going to just go into my next powerlifting meet having never done a 1RM test and just assume that whatever modeled 1RM is at based upon the load I was training with and the velocity I did from last week is going to be my maximal attempt on game day, right? So that's an example of actually a model, right? A mathematical relationship that we can model based upon real world data that is less accurate than the actual thing we're trying to predict. And again, when we can predict it, that's great. But when we can actually test it under controlled conditions, that's better, and we should be doing it.
Eric, they don't want to see you win. Let's talk about this then. But the communication between evidence-based practitioners, where I assume it's probably either within the community or somewhere around it, right, where we're having these conversations. You kind of just gave a great illustration of exactly what you're talking about. You spoke about the philosophy of science. You spoke about the models or what models to use and how to build them and why they should have, mathematical relationships. How then is this discourse done in the community where, once again, it's not one time this happens. It's actually either the space rewards it, the type of content, but I assume this is an open discourse, right? It's not like you're making your own content. Person ABC over there is doing the same thing, and you guys never, guys and gals, never communicate with one another. Like, how has this conversation then evolved where this happened? You brought up an example, years ago, or like you brought up meal timing. This is a reoccurring issue. So
yes.
Where is the current conversation then with some of these things?
Yeah. So I'm gonna give people a great example of how it worked in the past and how I think it's currently operating and why we're in flux at the moment. We'll use meal timing as one. Shout out to Alan Aragon. He was probably the most obvious vocal proponent of, hey, something is not connecting with what the claims are. Several very popular books were written in the early 2000s, the late 90s around the importance of meal timing. And there was even a claim in one published paper that protein timing was more important than the total protein dose. And this was not all based upon false data, but it was based on inappropriate data. The vast majority of it was looking at 4 to 10 hour studies at most of muscle protein synthesis responses when people would feed close to or not at all or in too far of a proximity to a resistance training session with whey protein. And they would see, hey, you give a certain bolus, but not too much. You max out the muscle protein synthesis response. and then it takes a certain amount of time before you overcome the quote-unquote refractory period where you can't re-stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Therefore, you should be eating 20 to 40 grams 4 times per day. And this kind of doesn't make sense because we're like, hold on, so 80 to 160 grams of protein for everybody in all cases, no matter what. And by the way, we've never seen an applied study where a meal frequency greater than 3 times per day with a sufficiently high protein intake has been better for hypertrophy or strength. This doesn't comport with systematic reviews. Eventually, it didn't comport with a meta-analysis that Aragon and Schoenfeld and I think Krieger led in 2013. And they showed, listen, when we actually look at just the studies on this, not the case. Subsequent research and all the way to today, we now understand why that is. We understand that when you go into a training session fasted, when you're only eating whey protein and nothing else, you can see these pretty sharp peaks and valleys in muscle protein synthesis. But if you simply just feed a large bolus of protein, it slows down gastric emptying. Therefore, that protein doesn't get broken down as fast in the GI tract. Those amino acids don't get peeled off as quickly. Blood level of amino acids don't rise as fast. And therefore, those amino acids are not getting to muscle at the same speed. Those peaks and valleys become these shallow dips. And all of a sudden, you have a conga line of food in your stomach. And that's just with a high protein dose. Forget lipids, forget fiber, forget a whole meal, and also forget the fact that sometimes unaccustomed exercises drives up muscle protein synthesis from damage. That's a whole other issue, confounding it even further. But in the real world, as long as you're eating at least 3 meals per day and a sufficiently high protein intake, some of these meal timing differences make almost no difference outside of extreme circumstances, or maybe people who are really trying to optimize everything. We get that now. We made the error in the first place, though, because we kind of jumped ship just going on the model based upon muscle protein synthesis. Today, what does that look like? Well, one example would be the effective reps model, which we talked about a couple times on the podcast. If you really want to do a deep dive on this, check out Stronger by Science. Check out the article written by Greg Nuckols. And this is basically a hard stance of only the last 5 reps count for hypertrophy. Softer stance is basically the closer you get to failure, the more stimulative that set will be, which actually has been proven by the data, but certainly not the last 5 reps, because even 10 RIR on average seems to stimulate hypertrophy when we actually look at the meta-regression by Robinson. That's one example. So I will say, to give credit, the record has typically eventually gets corrected, but it sometimes takes multiple years of people making recommendations that are very strong, very confident, and are essentially, if not outright wrong, limited. And the thing that I get concerned about is people will soften their stance on the model or the recommendation as far as what you do in an applied sense, but really not touch the underlying description of, okay, here's how mechanistically things are. And what I think actually needs to happen is we need to go back and go, okay, well, if we said that this frequency of training or this volume of training or this rep range or this proximity to failure was ideal because of X, Y, and Z, very clear physiological understanding that we have of hypertrophy mechanisms, you can change that recommendation for frequency, volume, proximity to failure. But if you have to keep doing that, I would think that logically you should go back to the drawing board and go, okay, maybe we don't have an understanding of the physiological mechanisms and determinants of hypertrophy as well figured out as we previously claimed. But that's the missing piece that right now doesn't seem to be occurring. The fundamental physiology and the claims being made around what stimulates hypertrophy and how does it work haven't changed, despite the fact that the record has been somewhat corrected around, for example, the effective reps model. And I see that as a problem because people have a ton of confidence and they're making these assumptions, and there's relatively wide-ranging practical applications. So that's where we are currently. And what I'm asking people to do is, okay, let's call this a model. Let's say it is a model. And I think first and foremost, any model needs to be evaluated by how well does it comport with empirical data. So any model that is inconsistent with the observations we have in applied research of a sufficient amount, which we do have. We got meta-analyses now, multiple meta-analyses on rest intervals, on drop sets. We got meta-analyses on volume-equated frequency studies, right? Schoenfeld and Gurgic 2018, 23 studies that show, with I think 10 or 13 of them, in a mixture of trained and untrained people in a span of low to high volumes, indicating that in a span of relatively low to high volumes, I think 3 to 15 sets per week, it doesn't really matter what your frequency is in like the 1 to 4 muscle group per week training frequency if the volume is equated, right? Maybe it does at higher levels, but the point being is if you have to disregard dozens of studies to maintain your belief in a model, that's a problem. So we have to either modify or reject any model that is not supported by a great deal of empirical data. So a model should be able to explain past observations. It should be able to predict future observations. We also have to consider, should it be the best tool to use, this model, or can we just use the empirical research? And it's not an either or, but I think we have to think about it. And the goal of any scientifically minded person who's interested in getting closer to the truth should be to, and this is critically important, test what they think they know and try to disconfirm their hypotheses. Or simply put, try to figure out what would the world look like if I was wrong? And does the world look like that or not, right? You're trying to find evidence to refute what you believe. So refutability is huge rather than confirmation, because in the field of exercise science where we have low sample sizes, and we've seen in other low sample size human-based research like social psychology, the replication crisis occurred. It's critically important to understand that we need to be able to look broadly and with a level of humility, knowing that not any single study is probably sacrosanct. How does the data look overall? And you can't just ignore the empirical research and look at a model and have a true understanding of things. You have to use one to check the other. So anyone who wants to be understanding how things operate, they need to look at their beliefs and then look for evidence that refutes it. Okay, if this is true, what else must be true? Or what can't be false? And I think that is really critical. And that's what's not happening right now. What seems to be happening right now is people have a model, it makes sense, it is emotionally satisfying for the reasons we already talked about, and then they look for research which supports it, and they look for reasons to reject the research which doesn't support it. And it's only when there's an overwhelming disconnect, like I said, a massive analysis of a bunch of studies, like a meta-regression or 20 plus studies on a topic, is there any movement there? And even now, I'm starting to see issues where even that's insufficient. So I had some comment on Instagram. Someone asked me, hey, Eric, if I'm doing 10 sets, do I need to worry about the frequency? And I said, probably, 10 sets is not that high a volume for a given muscle group. It wouldn't be ideal. You could get that all done in one session. The quality might start to degrade towards the end. And I don't think it would produce too much of a difference if you did it 2 or 3 times per week. And then someone came in and said, no, it'd be way better to do, 4 sessions or 3 sessions and split it up. And I mentioned, well, that doesn't comport with the meta-analysis by Schoenfelden. And they said, well, that doesn't make any sense. Of course, you're going to preserve better quality of training. So instead of questioning their beliefs or the model that they were operating on, they were happy to just disregard a meta-analysis on 25 studies. And they even made some claims that were testable. No. This is because the volumes in that meta-analysis were unrecoverable. And so first off, okay, what's recovery? If they're getting greater hypertrophy or similar hypertrophy and they're making gains, then they are recovering. And we do see a dose-response relationship with hypertrophy. So somehow they're not recovering, but not to the point where it actually degrades hypertrophy. So that doesn't make any sense. 2, are all of the studies in this meta-analysis high volume? No. In fact, when we're looking at the ones comparing volume equated sets per week, it ranges from 3 to 15. That's low to moderate volume as by most people's estimations. So that doesn't comport. But this person clearly had very strong opinions and actually had a very sound understanding of the model, and they seemed intelligent, but they were unwilling to question it because of how satisfying it was intellectually and how clear-cut and ABCD logical it was. So the logic appealed so much that they were unwilling to question it from the empirical data, which can seem more wishy-washy, can seem inconsistent. Why are there some studies which do show a benefit of higher frequencies, some which show a benefit of lower, but the overall point estimate is that there's no significant difference in volume-equated studies of 1 to 4 sessions per week, splitting up your volume. They weren't able to reconcile it, and they just eventually stopped responding. So I just thought we got to talk about this because models are great. I think they're excellent teaching tools. I love me a good infographic. You can say so much more in a picture than you like. I have to do a whole 45-minute podcast session to explain this and what could be represented very easily in one picture. And it's kind of that, the bullshit asymmetry law that we talked about previously. It's where it only takes a few minutes to put some false information out there, but it takes tremendously more work to correct the record. And it's far more intellectually satisfying to have a very clear-cut, black and white description of how things operate than to go, yeah, that could be true, but maybe not in these conditions, and maybe there's more to it, and here are the limitations. But essentially, the take-home message, Omar, is any model, it needs to be able to explain what we're actually observing in the real world. And if you want to get closer to the truth, you need to not be looking for evidence to support what you already believe or support a theory, but you need to try to look for high-quality evidence which could not be true if that theory was true, or that there is some limitation to it. You need to be looking to try to actively disprove your beliefs if you truly want to move towards the truth in the most efficient manner possible.
Eric, I love it. We're essentially speaking to the listener, to the consumer of, let's say, science communication. What would be, I guess, your overall message to then fellow scientists or science communicators that participate then in the space? Because I think it's an entirely different dialogue, right? Where you're now pointing out some errors that listeners can understand. But for those, not that are committing these errors, but let's say might be prone, or folks that you've had to have these conversations with. So you brought up before, like some meal timing, great example from over a decade ago. And now some of the people that were, let's say advocating for very specific meal timing, they have financial interest, they have like books or so on and so forth. So then it kind of gets sticky in quotations to convince them, or you go on this whack-a-mole approach, kind of what you spoke about before. But for fellow science communicators, let's say, where you might see this as an issue, how best would you approach it? Like, what does that dialogue look like? Because it's entirely different where you're saying, hey, like this person left a comment, they're talking about frequency, but wait a minute, why do you think that is so? So on and so forth. That all makes sense. I think listeners understand that. But it seems to be, partially the responsibility of these communicators that might not be either communicating effectively or making some of these errors. How do you begin that dialogue, in your opinion? So you used an example from a decade ago. This is like a repeating pattern throughout the space, different, subjects, but nonetheless something similar. How do you begin, let's say, that dialogue where someone seems to be like fixated on a potential model, looking for ways to confirm it, and then anything that potentially disconfirms it, they throw out for A, B, C, D reasons? Like, how do you begin, just real briefly, that type of dialogue? Because it's those individuals that are essentially disseminating some of this information that then other communicators, unless I'm mistaken here, have to play kind of whack-a-mole, right?
Yeah, that is the way it is. And I guess the way I would start it is if I had someone in front of me who, you're an idiot and I'm smart, be more like me. That always gets them, Omar.
Yeah.
That's the path to emotional intelligence. No, I would start with, okay, awesome. I love that you're creating a clear guide so people understand not just what to do, but why and how. I love that the people who are questioning me or bringing up these things and creating this back and forth, they can tell you why, step by step, it makes sense to train in a certain way. And that is actually a level of critical thinking that I want people to have on this given topic. So the fact that these science communicators are encouraging people to understand the mechanistic rationale and the why behind things is great, because then you can actually play with these ideas. Even if, unfortunately, right now, the applied outcome is less than ideal, understanding based upon this model when and why they would manipulate RIR, proximity to failure, repetition range, and frequency of training and volume, that's great. But I would just say, awesome, fantastic. But what I want you to do is, okay, you've built your house of cards, now blow on it. How do you blow on it? I want you to look at the most recent meta-analyses or handful of collection of studies of the most applicable, strongest evidence that is out there. So the thing that is directly testing this, not a mechanism, but the applied empirical research that is going out there and taking the translational application of the model that you understand and putting it out into the real world. So in hypertrophy, that's going to be the actual training studies If we're going to be talking about frequency, all right, when do they do equated volume with trained and untrained groups in different volume ranges, and we're manipulating frequency as the independent variable. So you want to actually test your model. You want to look at it empirically. And if you're not comfortable actually getting into R and actually doing a meta-regression, that's fine. But do a relatively objective, informal kind of vote counting survey. Like take a look at some of the most recent narrative reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analyses or meta-regressions published, and then just look at the studies that are in there. And how often do those studies align with what you're claiming? And if it's the minority of them or really a wash that are actually suggesting that what you have claimed in your model is accurate, then maybe don't put the model out yet. Or maybe if you're going to put it out there, you need to put it out there with the appropriate disclaimers and limitations. That's where I would start that conversation.
Yeah, Eric, I love it because it just seems, to me, you brought up an example from a decade ago. You brought up several examples, and it's just peppered throughout time. And I think it's not something that you can solve, in quotations, once and for all. But I think with open dialogue and communication and willingness from all sides to have these conversations, and to your point, something that I think that is cool versus over 15 years ago, let's say where someone can have like one of these models and you're in your own silo. These days, ideas are challenged more or less because it is an open forum, right? Like we're either on social media or whatnot. So we are having these conversations that over time we could get closer to the approximate idea of maybe not what is true, but what is definitely not true, you know?
Yes, exactly. Right. So let's say you believe a certain repetition range is ideal for hypertrophy. Cool. Well, if that is true, then what we should observe? We should observe that when people training in this repetition range over the long term in different conditions, if it is a meaningful enough relationship, we get better hypertrophy in that rep range. And we have comparisons of high versus low repetition ranges, matched number of sets or matched total volume, producing equated hypertrophy or similar hypertrophy, or no significant difference at least. Okay, cool. Well, we can't believe that there is a specific rep range that is really, really favorable for hypertrophy. This is something we kind of solved from a while ago. All right, rest intervals, same deal, right? Frequency, same deal. And we have this data. And we have this data in a relatively robust manner now in 2024. And we've got meta-regressions coming out on proximity to failure, volume, frequency. So I would just encourage people, exactly what you said, Omar, is try to figure out what wouldn't be true, or what do we not know if we assume certain things, or if we come forth with a hypothesis. Because the foundation of the typical approach we use to figuring out the truth in empirical human-based research is we create a hypothesis, and then we do null hypothesis testing, right? That is creating a p-value. We're seeing, okay, what is the likelihood that the fact that my hypothesis is incorrect would occur versus the actual hypothesis being accurate. So I would just encourage people to not just look at the raw stats and see it in a black and white manner, but actually understand what is it that we're really doing, and how do the methods that we use in studies and the appropriate statistical and data analysis tools we have to test them, what does it really mean? Not just, okay, cool, I can tick that in the column of it supports my pet theory or not.
Eric, I love it. Unfortunately, we did it again. We said it was going to be a 45-minute episode. We said, hey, TikTokers, this one's for you. Zip zop, we got you. And it's a 50-minute episode. And that's okay, because we rather over-deliver than under-deliver. I think, we're going to have to speak with them, though, because they're aging out. They're getting furious. They said, hey, make 20-second podcasts. And then we said, hey, is that even a podcast? And then they also said, what's a podcast? It was a whole weird conversation. It mainly was, once again, a conversation between us verbally, them interpretive dance. So it's hard. It's kind of like, there was that break dancer, that was in the Olympics, I think, with some sort of dancing that it's
Ray
hard.
Gun is her name?
Yeah, it's just hard sometimes to understand with interpretive dance in various forms, like what someone's trying to communicate. So maybe we're wrong, Eric, is what I'm saying.
Shout out Ray Gun. That's all I gotta say. You never know.
Shout out ? Yeah, I just can't wait though to see how their responses, unfortunately, because it'll be timed, no one will be able to interpret them. It's like a 5-second thing, it's a 10-second thing. no words being spoken, but they're like, hey, wait a second. You just said an infographic can, describe something that took you 45 minutes. And their response would be, my 5-second dance can describe this entire podcast. So maybe it's a teaching moment for us, Eric.
We just need to learn how to dab in an effective way that communicates what they need to know. I think dabbing is still a thing, right?
We got to ask the zip zoppers, because unfortunately the TikTokers now they're not gainfully employed, but they're of the age where they should be gainfully employed, So it's one of those things.
They're considering writing a CV when they're not on social media. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. But no, this has been another episode. We want to give a shout out to every single person for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. Thank you to Eric for this episode. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It does seem to help us out. Typically, people will give 5 stars. We leave it to your own judgment what you want to give. We're back every single Monday from now until the end of time. We'll see you in that next episode.